May 11th, 1945. 70 miles east of Okinawa, the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill steamed through broken clouds as radar operators strained to separate friendly returns from the chaos of morning combat air patrols. On the flight deck, 34 aircraft sat fueled and armed, engines warm, pilots waiting for launch orders. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher's flag cabin overlooked this scene from the island superstructure. His staff worked through intelligence reports, while gun crews scanned storm-darkened skies. At 10:05, a keen-eyed lookout caught movement in the low clouds. Before the word could reach general quarters stations, before the first warning could sound across the ship's loudspeakers, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter emerged from grey overcast and dove toward the packed flight deck. Lieutenant Junior Grade Seizo Yasunori's aircraft dropped a 550-pound bomb that punched through steel plating at a sharp angle, passed completely through the ship's hull, and detonated in mid-air over open water. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Zero itself crashed into the waiting aircraft in a shower of burning aviation gasoline. 30 seconds later, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa's Zero screamed through the same gap in cloud cover, dropped its bomb near the island structure, and slammed into the superstructure in a fireball that engulfed Admiral Mitscher's quarters and the ship's nerve center. Ogawa's bomb penetrated to the gallery deck, where it exploded in Air Group 84's ready rooms, killing pilots and aircrew instantly. Within 2 minutes, 396 men were dead or dying. 264 more were wounded. The Bunker Hill became a floating inferno. What killed these men was not luck or superior Japanese tactics. What killed them was a tactical reality that American naval planners had been studying with growing alarm since October 1944. The kamikaze aircraft was nearly unstoppable once committed to its dive. Conventional, anti-aircraft doctrine assumed attackers would break off when damaged, would turn away when faced with concentrated fire, would choose survival over target destruction. Kamikaze pilots eliminated these assumptions. They flew through defensive fire that would have turned back any rational attacker. They absorbed damage that crippled their aircraft but continued toward their targets on sheer momentum and dying engine power. They required complete destruction to stop, not merely damage sufficient to discourage. The mathematics were brutal. A conventional bomber damaged at 3,000 yards would typically abort its attack run. A kamikaze damaged at 3,000 yards would continue, unless physically incapable of flight. This meant defensive weapons had to achieve kills, not merely hits. The difference between wounding an aircraft and destroying it became the difference between a near miss and a direct strike, between damage control parties, fighting isolated fires, and entire ships engulfed in flames. American gun crews discovered this reality through blood and burning steel. The 5-inch naval guns that formed the backbone of fleet air defense fired shells weighing 54 pounds at targets moving 300 to 400 miles per hour. These weapons achieved excellent results against conventional attackers, using proximity-fused ammunition that detonated near targets without requiring direct hits. Against kamikaze attackers, proximity fuses remained essential but insufficient. A shell exploding 100 feet from a conventional bomber might cause the pilot to break off his attack. The same shell exploding 100 feet from a kamikaze merely damaged an aircraft whose pilot had no intention of breaking off regardless of damage sustained. The solution required weapons that could put overwhelming volumes of explosive shells into the exact airspace a diving kamikaze would occupy in the seconds before impact. This demanded rapid-fire weapons accurate, enough to track fast-moving targets, powerful enough to destroy aircraft rather than merely damage them, and quick enough to engage multiple threats in rapid succession. In 1945, only one weapon system met all these requirements. The 40mm Bofors automatic gun became the primary defense against the most terrifying tactical innovation of the Pacific War. The story of how this Swedish-designed weapon saved American ships and sailors begins not in the Pacific, but in the quiet offices of AB Bofors, in Karlskoga, Sweden, where engineers in the late 1920s faced a problem that seemed mundane compared to kamikaze attacks, but was in fact the same problem viewed through a different lens. How do you hit an aircraft that doesn't want to be hit? November 1928. The Royal Swedish Naval Materiel Administration approached AB Bofors with a contract for development of a new anti-aircraft weapon. The Swedish Navy had been using British Vickers 2-pounder pom-pom guns since 1922, but these weapons were proving inadequate against modern aircraft. The requirement was specific: develop an automatic anti-aircraft gun capable of engaging targets at altitudes up to 15,000 feet, firing projectiles large enough to destroy aircraft with a single hit, and maintaining a rate of fire sufficient to create effective defensive barriers. The challenge appeared insurmountable. Existing anti-aircraft weapons fell into two categories, neither satisfactory. Heavy guns fired large projectiles capable of destroying aircraft, but cycled too slowly to track fast-moving targets. Light machine guns tracked targets effectively, but fired projectiles too small to reliably destroy aircraft. What was needed was something in between, a weapon that combined the destructive power of artillery with the rapid-fire capability of machine guns. Chief Engineer Victor Hamar led the development team. Hamar understood that the fundamental problem of anti-aircraft gunnery was prediction. An aircraft traveling 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet every second. A shell fired from the ground took between 10 and 30 seconds to reach altitude depending on the target's height. During that flight time, the target aircraft could move more than 2 miles from where it had been when the gun fired. Effective anti-aircraft fire required predicting where the target would be when the shell arrived, not where it was when the gun fired. This prediction problem had two components. First, the fire control solution, calculating the future position of a moving target based on its observed course, speed, and altitude. Second, the engagement problem, putting enough explosive shells into that predicted position to ensure at least one hit on an aircraft whose pilot was actively maneuvering to avoid being hit. Traditional heavy anti-aircraft guns addressed the fire control solution through sophisticated mechanical computers and optical rangefinders, but struggled with the engagement problem because their slow rate of fire meant each shot had to be nearly perfect. Machine guns addressed the engagement problem through volume of fire, but lacked the range and destructive power to be effective at altitude. Hamar's team developed a weapon that balanced these competing requirements. The 40mm bore diameter was chosen deliberately. It was large enough to fire a projectile weighing nearly 2 pounds with sufficient explosive content to destroy an aircraft. It was small enough to permit automatic operation at rates of fire exceeding 100 rounds per minute. The specific mechanism Hamar designed used a vertical sliding breech block and recoil operation. When the gun fired, the recoil energy drove the barrel and bolt assembly backward. This rearward motion ejected the spent cartridge case, cocked the firing mechanism, and loaded the next round from a 4-round clip. If the gunner kept his foot on the firing pedal, the gun would cycle continuously, firing 2 rounds per second until the clip was empty. The first prototype emerged from Bofors workshops in November 1931. Early tests revealed problems. The cycling mechanism jammed under sustained fire. The gravity-fed loading system proved unreliable. The barrel overheated after prolonged firing. Hamar's team spent the next 3 years refining the design. They modified the feed mechanism to improve reliability. They developed procedures for quick barrel changes to manage heat. They tested various ammunition types to optimize the combination of muzzle velocity, projectile weight, and explosive content. By 1934, the 40mm Bofors L-60 was ready for production. The designation L-60 indicated a barrel length of 60 calibers, meaning the barrel was 60 times the bore diameter, or 2,400 millimeters long. This length provided the muzzle velocity necessary for effective range, while remaining short enough for the weapon to be mounted on mobile carriages or ship turrets. The timing was perfect. Europe was rearming. The threat from military aviation was becoming impossible to ignore. Nations that had spent the 1920s reducing their armed forces were suddenly desperate for modern weapons. The Bofors 40mm entered a market primed for exactly what it offered: an intermediate anti-aircraft weapon that filled the gap between inadequate light machine guns and ponderous heavy artillery. The Dutch Navy placed the first foreign order in August 1934. 5 twin-gun mounts for the cruiser, De Ruyter. In April 1935, Bofors unveiled a towed version mounted on a four-wheeled carriage, expanding the weapons market to Army ground forces. Belgium ordered 8 units immediately. Poland, Norway, and Finland followed. The Swedish Army formally adopted the weapon in 1936 as the 40mm Luftvärnskanon M36. By 1939, 18 nations had purchased licenses to manufacture the Bofors 40mm gun locally. These included Poland, Finland, Greece, Norway, France, and, crucially, the United Kingdom. The British Army tested Polish-built examples in 1937 and immediately recognized the weapon's potential. After making minor modifications to adapt metric measurements to imperial units, British factories began production of what they designated the QF 40mm Mark I. Commonwealth factories would eventually produce over 19,000 Bofors guns during the war. The weapon's specifications represented the state-of-the-art in 1935 anti-aircraft design. Bore diameter, 40 mm. Barrel length, 2,250 mm. Weight of complete gun, 522 kilograms. Weight of projectile, 900 grams. Muzzle velocity, 850 meters per second. Maximum vertical range, 6,950 meters. Effective engagement range against aircraft, approximately 2,700 meters. Rate of fire, 120 rounds per minute cyclic, 60 to 90 rounds per minute practical depending on loader skill. These were not merely numbers on specification sheets. They represented the practical limits of what could be achieved with 1930s technology. The 900-gram high-explosive shell was the smallest projectile that could reliably destroy an aircraft with a proximity hit. Larger projectiles would have required heavier guns firing more slowly. Smaller projectiles would have lacked destructive power. The 850 meter per second muzzle velocity provided sufficient range to engage aircraft at altitudes where conventional machine guns became ineffective while remaining low enough that the projectile's time of flight didn't make prediction impossible. The 120 round per minute rate of fire was fast enough to create dense defensive patterns, but slow enough that skilled loaders could keep up by manually feeding 4-round clips. Higher rates would have required mechanical feeding systems that added weight and complexity. Lower rates would have reduced the weapon's ability to track fast-moving targets. When war came to Europe in September 1939, the Bofors 40mm gun was already the most widely distributed medium anti-aircraft weapon in the world. It equipped the armed forces of neutral Sweden, Allied Britain and France, and occupied Poland. Within 2 years it would be fighting on every front, defending British cities during the Blitz, protecting Allied convoys in the North Atlantic, and most significantly, forming the backbone of naval air defence in a theatre where the threat from the air would exceed anything European planners had imagined. The United States came late to the Bofors. In 1938, the US Army had introduced its own 37mm automatic gun, designated the M1. This weapon proved disappointing in testing. It lacked range, fired a projectile too small for reliable aircraft destruction, and suffered from mechanical reliability problems. In early 1940, 6 British Bofors guns were imported for comparison testing along with kerosene predictor fire control directors. The difference was immediately apparent. The Bofors outperformed the American 37mm in every measurable category: range, rate of fire, reliability, and most critically, effectiveness against aircraft targets. But the United States could not simply license the weapon. War was coming, perhaps already here in everything but formal declaration, and America was neutral in law, if not in sympathy. Between late 1940 and June 1941, American factories produced Bofors guns illegally to aid British war efforts. These weapons bore no identification connecting them to Bofors. They were shipped to Britain through circuitous routes designed to maintain plausible deniability. Only in June 1941 did Bofors AB formally grant the United States a manufacturing license. The U.S. Army designated their version the 40mm automatic gun M1. The U.S. Navy, which had been searching desperately for a replacement for the inadequate 1.1-inch quad-mount and 50-caliber machine guns that armed American warships, designated their version simply the 40mm Mark I. Both services made modifications to the Swedish original. The Army version used air cooling and manual traverse. The Navy version used water cooling for the barrel and power traverse for the mount, allowing rapid target tracking. The Navy also developed twin and quadruple mounts, effectively mounting 2 or 4 guns on a single rotating platform. Production contracts went to Chrysler Corporation, which would become the primary American manufacturer. By war's end, Chrysler alone would produce approximately 60,000 guns and over 120,000 barrels. Other contractors, including Firestone, York Safe and Lock, and Pontiac Motor Division, added their production to American capacity. Total U.S. production exceeded 150,000 guns. British, Canadian, and Australian factories added another 25,000. By 1945, more than 175,000 Bofors 40mm guns were in service worldwide, making it the most widely produced medium anti-aircraft weapon in history. For the U.S. Navy, the Bofors arrived at exactly the moment it became desperately needed. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, demonstrated with brutal clarity that existing American anti-aircraft weapons were inadequate. 1.1-inch guns had proven unreliable. 50-caliber machine guns lacked range and hitting power. 5-inch guns were effective at altitude but too slow to track low-level attackers. Japanese aircraft had attacked with near impunity, sinking battleships and destroying aircraft on the ground while American defenders struggled to bring effective fire to bear. The first American production Bofors guns reached the fleet in mid-1942. Installation proceeded rapidly. Every vessel larger than a patrol torpedo boat received at least one 40mm mount. Destroyers typically carried 4 to 6 guns in twin mounts. Cruisers carried 12 to 20 guns. Fleet carriers of the Essex class mounted up to 72 barrels in 18 quadruple mounts. Battleships of the Iowa class carried 80 40mm guns in 20 quadruple mounts. These numbers represented more than simple multiplication of firepower. They represented a fundamental shift in naval anti-aircraft doctrine. Pre-war doctrine had emphasized fire control, achieving hits through accurate prediction and precise gun laying. The Bofors enabled a new doctrine that emphasized fire density, achieving kills through saturation of defensive zones with high explosive projectiles. A single Bofors firing at 120 rounds per minute for 30 seconds put 60 shells into the air. An Essex-class carrier with 72 Bofors guns firing simultaneously for 30 seconds put over 4,000 shells into the air, creating a defensive barrier through which few aircraft could penetrate undamaged. The tactical employment of Bofors guns evolved through combat experience. Initial doctrine placed them primarily for beam defense, protecting ships from attackers approaching from the sides where aircraft were most visible longest. Combat experience revealed that modern naval air attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, requiring 360-degree coverage. Gun mounts were relocated to provide overlapping fields of fire covering all approach vectors. Redundant fire control was installed to ensure that damage to one director wouldn't silence multiple guns. The guns themselves required skilled crews. A typical Navy quadruple mount was manned by 11 men, a mount captain who directed fire, a pointer who controlled elevation, a trainer who controlled traverse, 4 first loaders who fed 4-round clips into each of the 4 guns, 4 second loaders who brought clips from ready service ammunition racks, and additional ammunition passers who refilled the ready service racks from magazines below. Under combat conditions, a well-trained crew could maintain sustained fire at 100 rounds per minute per barrel for as long as ammunition lasted. By 1943, American ships sailing into combat carried thousands of rounds of 40mm ammunition per gun. An Essex-class carrier with 72 guns might carry over 100,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition, representing more than 80 tons of projectiles and propellant. This ammunition occupied substantial magazine space but was considered essential. Combat experience had shown that intense anti-aircraft battles could consume ammunition at rates that exceeded pre-war estimates by orders of magnitude. Through 1943 and into early 1944, if you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Bofors 40mm proved its worth in fleet actions across the Pacific. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carriers faced the largest Japanese carrier airstrike of the war. Over 300 Japanese aircraft attacked Task Force 58. American combat air patrols and shipboard anti-aircraft fire destroyed over 240 of them. Bofors guns accounted for a significant portion of the close-in kills, shredding aircraft that penetrated through the combat air patrol and 5-inch gun envelope to reach medium range. But the Philippine Sea represented conventional air attack, bomber and torpedo aircraft flown by pilots attempting to deliver weapons and return to their carriers. In October 1944, the nature of aerial warfare in the Pacific changed forever. Desperate Japanese commanders, facing inevitable defeat, authorized tactics that violated every assumption on which defensive doctrine was based. They ordered pilots to deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships, trading certain death for probable hits. The kamikaze had arrived, and with it came a crisis that would test whether the Bofors 40mm gun was truly capable of stopping attackers who refused to be discouraged by damage, deterred by defensive fire, or dissuaded by any consideration except complete destruction of their aircraft before impact. The mathematics of this new threat would prove more brutal than anything American naval gunners had yet faced. But buried in those mathematics was a narrow margin where speed of fire, density of projectiles, and destructive power of individual shells combined to create perhaps the only effective defense against suicide aircraft. That margin belonged to the Bofors. What the Japanese did not know, could not have known when they authorized the kamikaze attacks, was that American ships were armed with weapons specifically optimized for exactly this nightmare scenario. The Swedish engineers who had designed the 40mm Bofors in peaceful Karlskoga had inadvertently created the answer to a tactical problem that wouldn't exist for another 15 years. The collision between Japanese desperation and Swedish engineering was about to become the defining air-sea battle of the final year of the Pacific War. October 25, 1944, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The escort carrier USS Street Low steamed in formation with other small carriers supporting the American invasion of the Philippines. At 10:47 in the morning, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter dove from altitude, ignoring defensive fire from multiple ships. The pilot, flying with a squadron of 5 other Zeros, specially organized for this mission, aimed directly at Streetlow's flight deck. The aircraft struck near the centerline, its 500-pound bomb penetrating to the hangar deck before exploding among fueled and armed aircraft. Within 30 minutes, Streetlow sank. 134 men died in the first successful organized kamikaze attack of the Pacific War. The sinking validated a tactical concept that Japanese commanders had debated for months. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, recently appointed commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had argued that conventional air attacks were unsustainable. American combat air patrols and defensive fire destroyed Japanese aircraft at rates exceeding Japan's ability to replace them. Pilots reached operational units with minimal training, insufficient for complex bombing and torpedo attacks, but guiding an aircraft into a ship required only basic flying skills. The calculation was coldly rational. A conventional bombing attack might require 20 aircraft to achieve 2 hits on a carrier. Those 20 aircraft might face losses of 50 to 75%, resulting in 10 to 15 aircraft destroyed to achieve 2 bomb hits. A kamikaze attack with 5 aircraft guaranteed 5 hits if the pilots could reach their targets. Even if defensive fire destroyed 4 aircraft, the 5th would likely strike home. The mathematics favored suicide attacks by overwhelming margins. Onishi organized the first kamikaze units immediately after taking command in late October. The term kamikaze referenced typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, divine winds that saved Japan from foreign invasion. The official designation was Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, Special Attack Units. Pilots volunteered, though the definition of voluntary became elastic as the war progressed and pressure to accept suicide missions intensified. The attacks escalated rapidly. After Street, Low's sinking on October 25th, kamikaze strikes continued throughout the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Additional escort carriers were damaged. The cruiser HMAS Australia suffered hits from multiple kamikazes. By November, kamikaze attacks were systematic rather than experimental. By January 1945, all branches of Japanese armed forces had been ordered to organize suicide units. By mid-1945, Japan possessed a shadow military of special attack weapons, kamikaze aircraft, rocket-powered Oka flying bombs, suicide boats, human torpedoes, suicide submarines. For American naval commanders, the kamikaze represented a problem unlike any they had faced. Conventional air attacks could be countered through layered defense. Combat air patrols intercepted attackers at long range. 5-inch guns with proximity fuses engaged survivors at medium to long range. 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon guns handled close-in defense. This system had proven nearly impenetrable during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, when American defenses destroyed over 240 Japanese aircraft while losing only minimal ships to aerial attack. But the layered defense doctrine assumed attackers would break off when damaged or when faced with overwhelming defensive fire. Kamikaze pilots did neither. They pressed attacks through damage that would have forced conventional bombers to abort. They maintained course through defensive fire that conventional pilots would have evaded. Most critically, they required complete destruction to stop. A damaged bomber might limp away. A damaged kamikaze with enough control authority to steer would continue toward its target until impact or complete structural failure. The tactical implications were profound. Defensive doctrine had to shift from achieving damage to achieving kills. Near misses became irrelevant. Shells that exploded close enough to damage an aircraft without destroying it accomplished nothing if the aircraft retained sufficient control to complete its suicide dive. This meant defensive weapons had to achieve hits, not proximity kills. 5-inch guns with proximity fuses remained essential for long-range interception, but their effectiveness declined against targets that didn't break off when damaged. What was needed were weapons that could track fast-moving targets and deliver enough high-explosive shells directly into the target to guarantee physical destruction. The 40mm Bofors was ideally suited for this role, though its designers had never imagined such employment. The gun's characteristics aligned almost perfectly with the requirements for stopping kamikaze attacks. Consider the tactical geometry. A Zero fighter diving at 45 degrees toward a ship traveled approximately 300 miles per hour, or 440 feet per second. From an altitude of 3,000 feet, the dive required 7 seconds to reach the ship. During those 7 seconds, the aircraft covered 3,000 feet horizontally. A Bofors gun engaging this target at maximum effective range of approximately 3,000 yards had roughly 5 seconds of firing time before the aircraft either struck or passed over the ship. At 120 rounds per minute, a single Bofors could fire 10 shells during that engagement window. A quadruple mount firing simultaneously put 40 shells into the air. An Essex-class carrier with 18 quadruple mounts could theoretically fire 720 shells at a single target during a 5-second engagement. These numbers represented theoretical maximum performance. In practice, not all guns could bear on a single target. Gun crews needed time to acquire targets, train guns onto bearing, and open fire. Mechanical systems had lag. Human reactions introduced delay. Realistic estimates suggested that perhaps half the ship's 40mm battery could engage a single target during a typical kamikaze attack. For an Essex-class carrier, this still meant 360 shells from 40mm guns in the critical seconds before impact. The destructive power of those shells was substantial. Each 40mm high-explosive projectile weighed 900 grams and contained approximately 50 grams of explosive. The shell's time fuse was set to explode on impact, fragmenting the shell casing into hundreds of pieces of shrapnel, traveling at velocities sufficient to penetrate aircraft skin, sever control cables, damage engines, and wound or kill pilots. A single hit to an aircraft's engine would typically cause immediate power loss. A hit to a control surface would impair maneuverability. A hit to the fuselage might wound the pilot or sever hydraulic lines. The critical factor was hit probability. Against a target presenting a cross-section of approximately 100 square feet at ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 yards, a well-aimed burst from a Bofors quad mount had reasonable probability of scoring multiple hits. The gun's relatively flat trajectory at medium ranges meant shells arrived at nearly the same time despite being fired in sequence, creating a concentration of projectiles in a small volume of space. If the target aircraft happened to occupy that space at that moment, multiple hits were likely. Combat reports from late 1944 through 1945 documented this effectiveness repeatedly. At Okinawa, where American naval forces faced the most intensive kamikaze campaign of the war, 40mm guns accounted for a significant percentage of close-in kills. Destroyers on radar picket duty, positioned north of the main fleet to provide early warning, relied heavily on their Bofors batteries when Japanese aircraft penetrated to visual range. USS Leutze, a Fletcher-class destroyer, engaged multiple kamikazes on April 6, 1945. Her action report noted that 40mm fire destroyed 2 aircraft at ranges under 1,000 yards. In both cases, the aircraft disintegrated from multiple hits before reaching the ship. A third kamikaze, already damaged by 5-inch fire, crashed through the 40mm defensive envelope and struck the ship, but the preceding kills had prevented what would have been 3 separate hits. USS Hadley, another destroyer on picket duty, faced an even more intense engagement on May 11, 1945, the same day Bunker Hill was struck. Over a 90-minute period, Hadley's crew counted approximately 150 Japanese aircraft in the surrounding area. Hadley and the destroyer escort USS Evans, operating together, destroyed 23 aircraft with gunfire before multiple kamikazes struck both ships. Post-action analysis credited 40mm guns with the majority of close-in kills. The sustained fire from multiple Bofors mounts created defensive barriers dense enough to destroy aircraft that had already survived combat air patrol interception and 5-inch gun engagement. The gun crews who manned these weapons experienced combat conditions unlike anything in previous naval warfare. Traditional naval gunnery had been a methodical process. Optical rangefinders measured distance, mechanical computers calculated firing solutions, orders were passed to gun crews who executed them with precision. Bofors gunnery was immediate and visceral. Targets appeared suddenly, closing at speeds that measured in hundreds of feet per second. Gun crews had seconds to acquire, track, and destroy aircraft before they crashed into the ship. A typical Bofors gun captain on a quad mount directed his crew through headset communications, calling out target bearings while the pointer and trainer worked hand wheels or power controls to slew the mount onto target. The pointer controlled elevation, raising or lowering the gun barrels to match the target's altitude. The trainer controlled traverse, rotating the entire mount to follow the target's bearing. Both men looked through optical sights that provided LED computing reticles, mechanical devices that helped them aim ahead of the target to account for the target's motion and the shell's time of flight. When the pointer and trainer aligned their sights on target, they shouted confirmation. The gun captain ordered fire. 4 loaders, 1 for each barrel, slammed 4 round clips into the automatic loading mechanisms. The guns began cycling immediately, each barrel firing independently as its breech closed and firing pin struck. Empty brass cartridge cases ejected forward and to the sides, clattering onto the deck around the gun crew's feet. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous hammering roar that made voice communication impossible even with sound-powered phones. Tracers showed where the shells were going. Every 5th round was a tracer, its base filled with phosphorus compound that ignited and burned brightly, leaving a visible streak through the air. Gun crews watched these streaks and adjusted their aim, walking fire onto targets through visual observation. When tracers converged on an aircraft, the effect was immediately visible. Shells exploded on impact, throwing off flashes and smoke. Pieces of aircraft fell away. If the damage was sufficient, the aircraft would suddenly lurch off course or simply disintegrate in flight. But not always. This was the terrifying reality of kamikaze defense. Gun crews could see their shells hitting, could watch pieces of aircraft breaking away, and still the kamikaze would continue. Engines trailing smoke, control surfaces damaged, fuselage perforated, yet still coming, still diving, still aimed directly at the ship. Only catastrophic damage stopped them. Structural failure of wings, complete engine destruction, or pilot incapacitation. Anything less, and the aircraft might remain controllable long enough to strike home. The psychological impact on gun crews was severe. They understood with absolute clarity that their effectiveness determined whether they lived or died. If they destroyed the kamikaze before it reached the ship, they survived. If they failed, they might die in the resulting explosions and fires. There was no middle ground, no partial success. The immediate feedback loop between performance and survival created stress levels unprecedented in naval warfare. Ammunition consumption during kamikaze attacks exceeded any pre-war estimates. Ships that had been designed with magazine capacity for sustained but conventional combat found themselves expending thousands of rounds in single engagements. At Okinawa, where American ships remained on station for months under continuous air attack, ammunition resupply became a critical logistics challenge. Ammunition ships shuttled constantly between rear bases and the combat zone, delivering tens of thousands of rounds of 40mm ammunition to ships whose magazines had been depleted in days of intensive combat. The Navy developed procedures for hot ammunition transfer, rigging high lines between ships, steaming in formation to pass ammunition without stopping. Gun crews watched these resupply operations with keen interest, knowing that their survival in the next attack depended on full magazines. Ships that ran low on 40mm ammunition during attacks faced increasingly desperate situations as their defensive firepower degraded with each empty gun. By late spring 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had become the longest sustained carrier campaign of the Second World War and the bloodiest for the US Navy. Between April 1st and June 22nd, Japanese forces launched 10 major kikusui, mass kamikaze operations, plus hundreds of smaller attacks. American losses were staggering by Pacific War standards. 34 ships sunk, nearly 400 damaged, almost 5,000 sailors killed and roughly the same number wounded. These were the worst naval losses in any single operation of the entire war, exceeding Pearl Harbor in total casualties and damaged vessels. Yet the losses would have been catastrophically worse without the Bofors 40mm gun. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey examined kamikaze effectiveness and concluded that Japanese suicide attacks had been significantly more effective than conventional attacks in terms of damage per sortie. But the survey also noted that the majority of kamikaze aircraft were destroyed before reaching their targets. Combat air patrols accounted for the largest number of kills at long range. 5-inch guns with proximity fuses destroyed many more at medium range. At close range, where kamikazes entered their final dives and presented the most immediate threat, 40mm Bofors guns were credited with the majority of kills.